As an organizational leader, a business leader, and a boss, I've had to terminate people from their jobs. And I've not ever terminated someone because they were fully sighted. Vision is a way of processing the world. So just because I process the world differently doesn't mean that my skill set is diminished. I've started looking at people very differently that way too, to say, I don't really care what you can't do. I want to know what you can do. And let's talk about that. You might get this too. I see just like you when I take my glasses off. Now, I understand that that's coming from a good place, and people are just trying to relate to someone else and build a human-to-human connection, and I totally appreciate it. However, it is the equivalent of saying to someone who uses a wheelchair, I'm just like you when I sit down. It just doesn't make any sense.
That's the voice of Susan Robinson. She's a consultant, entrepreneur, blog writer, and yes, this is a podcast with a blindness perspective, and there's a lot more. It's about achieving goals, reaching your highest potential, and proving to yourself that you're doing the best that you can. Susan's TED Talk just went over 1 million views.
I'm uninterested in being pitied. I'm interested in being the best person that I can be and to be successful in the endeavors that I go after. And somebody pitying me is really an unfortunate obstacle that is unsolicited. I think this was my way of trying to get folks to broaden their thinking and reshape their philosophy, transform their philosophy on what is possible.
Susan's probably more comfortable talking to corporate executives and business leaders. And here she is on Blind Abilities, where you can get podcasts with a blindness perspective on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities, and download our free Blind Abilities app from the App Store. That's 2 words, Blind Abilities.
Again, people use that word disability, and it puts you in a space of what can't be possible, and failing at what can't be possible is probably a really good thing.
Welcome to Blind Abilities. I'm Jeff Thompson. Today we're talking to Susan Robinson. She's out of New York, and she's a consultant to executives and corporate leaders. She graduated from college, went to work, and then got into entrepreneurship. She's here with us on Blind Abilities to share her journey through college with vision loss and into the business world and starting her own company. Please welcome Susan Robinson. And Susan, thanks for coming on. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Jeff. Thanks so much for having me today.
Well, thank you for taking the time to come on to Blind Abilities. And Susan, I really enjoyed your TED Talk, and congratulations as you just surpassed 1 million views.
Well, thanks.
Well deserved.
It is so humbling to have offered something that's resonated around the world. You know, people tell me that they've been inspired by the talk and they've been motivated by the talk. And it's a real privilege to be in a position where you can do that for somebody else. It's a great honor. And to be chosen by TED to be part of the residency is a great honor. And for TED as a larger organization to have selected my talk to be on TED.com, again, just a huge honor. So I'm glad that the abundance is really everywhere, because the talk was not really designed for me. It was designed to share my experience. And it's been wonderful that the experience has really been a shared one around the world. It's really been amazing.
Excellent talk, and we'll put the links to that in the show notes. We'll get back to that, talk a little bit more about it. But let's start out by talking a little bit about Susan. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. I live in New York City, and I have for a long time. After wanting to be an orthopedic surgeon and halfway through college being told that I was visually impaired with a diagnosis of Stargardt's and that a clinical and surgical career wasn't possible, I sort of said to myself, as any smarty pants 19-year-old would say, well, if I can't operate in a hospital, I'll just operate the entire hospital. And I changed my major from biology to health policy and administration. I've worked in a number of different not-for-profit in the health healthcare industry as well as on the corporate side as well. And then I decided that it would be a great idea to launch off on my own. And I am now a consultant and advisor to executives in both the not-for-profit and the corporate spaces within the healthcare industry and outside of it. So we work on enterprise-wide problems that have significant and generally strategic impact on the business. And we have a lot of fun while we're doing it.
Well, that's going to be tough to get that on one business card. You mentioned earlier that you were in college, and at 19, is that when you started accepting the challenges of vision loss?
By the age of 19, that was my diagnosis. I guess technically 19 and a half. I've always worn glasses since the age of 8. As a kid, my glasses were kind of thick, and my classmates would always make note of that kind of thing. And it wasn't unusual for me to have trouble seeing something because everyone knew that my glasses were pretty heavy on the prescription. But by the time I was a senior in high school, I remember I was in the front row of class because I was just one of those kids. And I remember having to get out of my front row seat to get closer to the chalkboard in order to get the notes or things that the teacher was writing down on the board. And my classmates and friends, we've known each other for a long time, they would laugh and they'd say, "Oh, you need new glasses." And it sort of turned into a thing, but it wasn't much more than that because it was a different process. Everyone else could sit in their chair and see the board. I would get out of my chair, get the notes that I needed. And aside from that, there was nothing really significant. When I went to college, I went to Penn State, and my largest class as a biology major was 1,100 students in a large auditorium, Schwab Auditorium for anyone who knows it. And I would sit in the front row of Schwab Auditorium, and I wouldn't be able to get all the notes before the teacher would switch overheads, which clearly dates me of when I was in college. But it were these transparent sheets that once it was finished, the professor would take the previous one off and put the new one on. And I kept saying to my mother, I need new glasses, because as a child, I remember going to the ophthalmologist once a year. The lens prescription would change. I would get the new lenses and the world would be clear again. So I was looking for that experience and saying, "Mom, I need my glasses changed, or I need my contacts changed again." And so because I had been away at college and different physicians' schedules, I had a little bit of a keystone caper of a process, and somebody got my prescription wrong. Somebody new prescribed contact lenses that I was allergic to because there was protein buildup on contact lenses. I became allergic to that. We fixed that problem. And then finally, after addressing all of the little mishaps along the way and seeing the same ophthalmologist twice, he said, "Okay, you don't need your contacts changed. It's a different issue. I think that it might be this, but we're going to send you to a retina specialist to do all the confirmatory tests." And so at that point, I went to a retina specialist during the spring semester of my sophomore year in college. And that's when I was diagnosed with Stargardt's.
Confirmatory tests. Now that doesn't sound good.
Oh, that's a little bit of healthcare language, truth be told. Any ophthalmologist listening to that podcast might have cringed a little bit when I said that. It would be the test that would confirm that it's Stargardt's as opposed to suspicion based on some circumstantial evidence that he found during his examination.
How did you accept that? I'm sure when you're going in, you were just looking for a prescription and wanted that new world look again.
Yeah.
And boom, you're facing something that probably wasn't curable.
Yeah, the really interesting thing about the moment that I learned of the diagnosis is that I had a reaction that most people, from what I'm told, don't have. And from the reactions that I get from other people, a response that is surprising to them. So as a, typical overachiever, I like to do things well. I like to do them quickly, and I like to do as many things as possible as well as I possibly can. And so I had a particular level of frustration when I was in college, beginning my college years, because there were things that weren't happening that were normal to my experience. So I was a terrific student in high school, and I got to college and I wasn't a terrific student anymore. And I knew that my intellectual potential hadn't changed, but something else was awry. So initially one might think, especially any parents who are listening, they might think, oh, Susan was partying at frat parties and, doing other things besides focusing on her schoolwork. And I was enjoying my college experience, but not as a primary activity over my studies. And so I was not doing as well on tests. I couldn't get the notes from the overheads, as I mentioned before. Even things like being in class on an exam day, and everybody in the class would be finished with their exam and I would still have half of it to go. It just wasn't a normal experience to me. And so I felt a level of frustration that I couldn't explain why my college experience academically was so different than my high school experience academically. Oh, and then there were also sort of weird things, like I would say hi to people and it wouldn't be the person that I thought it was. People would be able to see things at a further distance than I would. And I remember being able to see things from a distance. So that's why I kept saying to my mom, like, I need my glasses changed, with the overheads being switched as the sort of primary evidence. So when I got this diagnosis of, okay, you're visually impaired, you have Stargardt's disease, and this is what it means, the first thing that went through my head was, thank goodness, now I understand why all of these weird things are happening. Having a reason for why all these odd things were happening was a sense of relief that is odd for some people to understand. I wasn't relieved to have a visual impairment, but I was relieved to have an explanation that made all of these odd things make sense, why they were happening, why it just came across as odd. So I would walk into a classroom with a professor and say, hi, I'm Susan, and I just want to let you know that I have a visual impairment and I can't get all the notes from your overheads before you switch them. Would it be okay for you if you would bring me a hard copy of them so that I could follow along in class? And every professor said, sure, of course. And so it allowed me to give an explanation to somebody else that got them to help me. It allowed me to understand why everything wasn't as it should have been based on my previous experience and expectation with life. And it allowed me to just move forward in a way that I thought was really positive. Again, not relieved to be visually impaired, but relieved to understand what was going on so that I could present it to somebody else so they could help me where it was necessary and I could just keep going on the path that I was going.
Now, all this is mostly outward stuff, like accomplishments and everything. What was it like inside Susan's head, personally, accepting the blindness?
I didn't notice it as much. I will always say I've since come a long way, which is really great. But when I was a kid, if I was picked second to last in gym class teams, it was a good day. I was pretty good in the books, but not so great athletically. So I didn't have that, oh, I can't see the basketball hoop anymore, or I misjudged the soccer ball timing and placement. Like, there was none of that. I played piano for 12 years, but at the time that I was diagnosed with my visual impairment, I could still read music. At the point in time of my diagnosis, there obviously was enough to make the diagnosis, but from a personal life perspective, I don't think there was that significant of an impact. Again, aside from things like thinking someone was somebody else because they had all the visual cues for being the person that I thought it was, but it wasn't. You know, fully sighted people say, oh, I do that too. It's sort of like my experience doesn't seem to be any less normal than somebody else's at that time. So I understand your question, but for me, most significantly, I noticed it academically.
Kind of being relieved.
Yeah, which is, again, it's an odd thing for people to hear, not relieved to be visually impaired, but relieved to have an explanation of why things weren't the way I thought that they should be, and a tool that allowed me to get other people to help me in the way that I needed in order to be as successful as I wanted to be.
That's a good suggestion for people who are going through a transition if they're losing eyesight. If they don't understand it and all of a sudden they've got the solution right there, it's like, got it. And then you can move forward.
Yeah. And for me, I think I'm sort of a natural problem solver. So to me, not being able to see the overheads and not being able to finish tests was a problem. And this was part of the solution. I mean, I had to do something with it, but it was a key piece of the solution that I couldn't have gotten from anyone else except a retina specialist.
Answers are great. Susan, your self-advocacy skills really carried you a long ways through college. Can you tell us a little bit about other alternative devices or techniques and what other areas of accessibility you found challenging?
That's a great question. So when I was diagnosed, I would say the ink on the Americans with Disabilities Act was still drying. So if I really want to date myself, let's just call a spade a spade. What an accommodation was, what people had to do, the language in the society that we have now is different than it was then. So I think self-advocacy was probably the most important piece because, I mean, I'm an extrovert, so I'll kind of talk to anybody and I'm a problem solver. And if the problem's mine, then I just, want to work it out. But I also was connected to the Pennsylvania Commission for the Blind at the time. And so I was connected to a low vision specialist, and I received from that person a couple of magnifying glasses that I used in order to read my books and to finish my tests. And it was amazing, the things that I was missing on tests. In calculus classes, for example, there are some negative signs in equations, and I just wouldn't see them at all because it would be in the part of my macula that just wasn't there anymore. I would use the tools. I had, sort of people checking in on me and making sure that everything was okay. But, I've always been a pretty motivated kid, or as a kid, I was always pretty motivated. And so I was almost keeping the adults at bay as they were saying, how are you doing? And this is such a change. And how are you going to manage this? And I was saying, I got this. I'm good. I got this. And so I think I really rejected the negative context of their questions because I was off to the races. Okay, fine. I couldn't be an orthopedic surgeon anymore. I will say that I still kind of argue the point in a humorous way that I still could be an orthopedic surgeon. It's just that nobody will give me malpractice insurance or be my patient, quite frankly. Yeah. But I still can accomplish a lot of things. So someone coming at me saying, oh, this is so terrible, unless you've experienced the same thing, I'm not sure how you've come to that conclusion, because something being terrible is a conclusion that somebody's made after analyzing a set of criteria. And fully sighted people oftentimes will say, oh, how do you do that? And that's coming from a place of wanting to understand, which is good. But also, I can't imagine living my life without vision. And my response to that is, you wouldn't have your life if you didn't have your vision. It's sort of square peg, round hole. So some of those questions that sort of negative impact, oh, this is how are you going to do this? And have you really thought about, I just kept the adults at bay and was sort of like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. I'm still in college. I can still go to my classes. I'm talking to my professors. I'm getting the notes. I can finish my tests. I can write my papers. It's all good. So anything that seemed to be counter to my experience, I just chalked up as a fully sighted person, just really not getting it.
Experience is good.
What I've deduced probably a lot through this kind of experience is that it's more helpful for me to ask somebody what their experience is like and ask if I can help in some way and what that looks like for them, as opposed to deciding what I think it should or shouldn't be based on what I think their experience is. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, it makes perfectly good sense. Sometimes I feel like I got this scarlet letter B on my shirt and people see me and think, wow, he needs some unsolicited assistance. And they get to have their Boy Scout moment.
Yeah, and sometimes it's really helpful, and I have a lot of friends who, they're always very mindful. There's a curb, there's a top of the step. And I know that it is coming from a very, very, very good place. Over the course of my career, 20/20 sighted people have said, wow, how do you accomplish all of that? And you're visually impaired. And I, for some of them, happen to know that my accomplishments outweigh theirs. Again, not to be braggadocious. And so the logic for them doesn't work in both directions. How do you do all of that and you're visually impaired? And my response is, how do you not do all of that and you're not visually impaired?
Yeah, it seems like we're always being challenged by the limited expectations that people put upon us. Because, not only did you get on a bus, travel downtown, transfer to a train, take the train, and then walk 3 blocks to your destination, and they're standing by the door wondering, how is this blind person ever going to get in this door?
Exactly, because Lord knows you're blind. You can't do anything when you're blind, right? And it's there's got to be a little bit of a reality check. And again, it's people trying to understand your experience through their life experience, and it just doesn't work that way.
It just seems that there's so many misconceptions that arrive before we do.
Right. And I think there's also something to be said for owning the message. And this is something that corporations do a lot, with their branding and with their taglines and that sort of thing. I always have felt that it's important for me to be able to communicate what I can do first and what I need somebody's help with second. I'm in college. I'm doing great. I got this. I can get all the notes. I just can't see your overheads. So if you can provide me a hard copy, we're good to go. And that's something very specific and very easy for somebody else to understand, meaning I just need to bring a hard copy for Susan. And it prevents them from making all kinds of assumptions of other things that I may or may not need, because I've already gotten ahead of it. I've communicated what I can do. I've communicated the specific actions that I need from somebody else. And it focuses them on what I need as opposed to what they think I might need.
Well, that's great. You own it and they can respond to it.
Exactly. And they can respond. I mean, people have responded in general very, very positively since the minute I was diagnosed. And there are some jerks in the world who have not responded very well. And, I've learned how to deal with them too. But thankfully, they don't come around very often. And I was explaining recently to somebody that people deal with people who know me well in particular. They deal with me and my visual impairment like they deal with someone who's on crutches. It's a side note. It's not the leading factor. So, okay, we get into a restaurant. Susan's going to need the menu read to her, particularly if it's dark. Okay, no big deal. But a lot of people like to have the menu read to them, which is why the waiter comes and tells you the specials. So there are lots of experiences where it's just really not a thing. It's not the issue that defines me. And for some people it is, and that's okay. It's just a particular circumstance that I have that necessitates that I work in a different way compared to someone with 20/20 vision.
Susan, with all that you learned in college about self-advocacy and asking for what you needed and getting it to succeed, how did you transfer that into the job application, interview process, and while you're searching for a job?
So I applied for jobs just like anybody else. I had my college degree. I had done an internship because that was required as part of my particular degree from Penn State. And so I started to create some networks, and I was in graduate school and I had a job while I was in graduate school. To me, it was no different than anyone else doing the same thing, with the exception of letting people know during an interview process what I might need from them. So again, it was the same sort of self-advocacy, to use your wonderful term, as I did in college. So in an interview process, the first interview is just sort of getting to know each other. Do I think I'll like working for this person? Because an interview is not just the employer figuring out if they want to hire you. It's you figuring out if you want to work for the employer as well. Once we got to maybe a level 2 or level 3 conversation in the interview process, at that point, when it seemed to be a little bit more concrete that the position possibly could be mine, I would disclose and I would say, I just want to let you know, I have a visual impairment. It may not be obvious to you, but what that means is I'm going to bring everything that we've already talked about, all of the skills and characteristics that we've discussed, but I am going to need a large monitor for my computer so that I can see things, enlarged a little bit. And generally, people were very receptive to that because, again, I'm letting them know, which is what every potential employer wants to know. Can you do the job? Are you willing to do the job? And are you going to be a good fit? And I was looking to demonstrate those 3 things just like any other job candidate, with the addition of, if you think I've got those 3 things, excellent, just know that I need a really big monitor. And that's for my particular situation. And for every employer that I've ever worked for, I really have never had an issue. And with my clients now, again, really, really not an issue. For me, it's always been important to be transparent and to let folks know, mostly because I learned that I have been told that I don't quote unquote look visually impaired, or I don't look like I quote have something wrong with me. That's my favorite one.
They don't do that at the salons, do they? Give you the I'm visually impaired look.
Right, exactly. I just always felt like if I was meeting the criteria of a qualified candidate, my visual impairment is a side note. Because if I can do the job and I want to do the job and I'm a good fit, then that really should be the criteria by which it's decided whether or not I'm offered the job. And then once I have it, then it's my job to be successful. So again, it might take me longer to read something. I might need the big monitor, but I was always trying to be successful in whatever job I had, including in the interview process.
I've noticed out of talking with you here and listening to you, you have a huge drive. Like when you set your goals on something, you aim for it and you go for it.
That's true.
I may be assuming here, but it sounds like it. And I've always said that, people can go out and get some of the best training in the world, but you can get there in a Buick. And what I mean by that is if you have drive, you're going to make it because you're going to find the institutes or the people to be around to get there. And that's all drive.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I will say, because folks have said, especially in discussing about jobs and being visually impaired or having other sorts of circumstances that make getting a job difficult sometimes, I have been a boss and I've been a department head and I've been an organizational leader. And whenever I have hired somebody, it's never because they're 20/20 sighted, or they've never had an organ transplant, or they do not have depression. I've hired all kinds of individuals on my teams because they were competent and skilled at what they did. And when they got on board, they were successful in the jobs that they had. So conversely, as an organizational leader, a business leader, and a boss, I've had to terminate people from their jobs. And I've not ever terminated someone because they were fully sighted or because they had an organ transplant. They were terminated because they did not fulfill the competencies and expectations of their job. And I know a lot of folks who I've interfaced with professionally feel the same way. So when someone walks in the door and they are driven and competent and they will get things done and they will be successful regardless of any obstacle that comes in their way, that's the kind of employee that you want to have on your team, and you want to make sure that you support them in their success. I mean, that's sort of my take on that. It's a little bit different than others, and certainly different from the way that the job market has been approached by a lot of people over a long time. But really leading with your talent and leading with your competencies and your confidence is a great way to think about excelling in school or in the workforce. If you want to start your own business, or if you want to be, a volunteer, whatever you want to do, to your points, the drive will help you along the way, and the skills and the know-how and the experience just supports the drive.
So Susan, your drive obviously helped you succeed. How did that play a part in you taking it to the next step and taking the risk of entrepreneurship and starting your own company?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say entrepreneurship finds its people in all sorts of ways. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs who sometimes were dissatisfied with a job, sometimes found that they had an idea that was so new that nobody else was doing it, so they had to launch it on their own. And I would say for me, it's similar to those two things. I loved being an employee at all of the organizations and companies that I worked for. And I also found that there were things about that particular system that didn't make me the happiest kind of person that I thought that I could be. So pursuing an entrepreneurial venture, it has its own variables and stressors and things that are unique to it. So it's not a land of unicorns and rainbows, but it's definitely an interesting career choice for people who are okay with lack of structure, who have an extreme pioneering spirit, and who really are passionate about whatever they are trying to accomplish. And again, they're willing to eliminate any obstacle that gets in the way of that success. So because those factors, those sort of characteristics applied to me, and I noticed that, and there was a specific opportunity. So I launched my consulting business after an employment role ended because the company was shutting down a particular section of the business that my work was related to. So at that point, I said, okay, well, I can go and get another job. That is one option. Or I've kind of always wanted to do this entrepreneurial thing, and maybe this is the right time to do it. And I chose the latter, and here we are today.
Susan, we briefly touched base on the TED Talk reaching 1 million views, and that's pretty big because someone may think that it was about consulting and entrepreneurship, and yet it was more on a humorous look at blindness. Can you tell us where the humor comes from?
Oh, thanks. Well, I don't know. I've been told for a very long time that I have a unique perspective on situations, and I would say that I'm a positive and optimistic person to begin with, and I really do like to laugh. There's a picture of me as a give or take a 9 or 10 month old, and I'm in a cute little yellow outfit, and I'm just laughing. And I remember an adult, maybe it was my mom or my grandmom, who said, we don't know what you were laughing about, but you were always laughing as a baby. And I think it's just part of my genetic makeup. And so my unique take on situations combined with just liking to laugh and being positive, all those things came together in the TED Talk. And some things are just really ridiculous. Who walks into a men's bathroom and when you're told, oh, this is the men's bathroom, who says, it's okay, everything is too small for me to see? Who says that? And so you sort of poke fun at yourself because some of it's just so ridiculous that you can't help but laugh.
I'm still laughing.
I know. And truth be told, it's the gift that keeps on giving, because I actually walked into a men's room in a police station about 3 weeks ago, and I was staring at the sign because men and women, the women, I don't see the letters WMEN at a particular distance, but the word women is longer than the word men. So I'm staring at the sign, and I'm like, I think that's like long enough to be women. As opposed to short enough to just be 3 letters in men. I think that's the women's room. And so I walked in and the door closed behind me, and there's a particular piece of equipment that's in a men's room that's not in the women's room. And I saw it and I was like, oh, I did it again. And I left the room, and there's a gentleman standing right outside who had been there the whole time. And I looked at him and I said, does that sign say men? And he said, yeah. And I said, you think you would tell a person? You saw that I was about to walk into the men's room. And he just sort of, shook it off and walked off. But I'm like, really? Like, you let me walk into the men's room. But he may have thought, like, she just wants to go to the men's room. So who knows?
So what was the TED Talk experience like for you?
Oh, the TED Talk experience was amazing. So first, I need to say that I was part of the TED Residency program. So the TED Residency is an incubator for breakthrough ideas, and it happens twice a year, where it's a competitive process. You have to apply and you have to share your idea and submit a video and letters of recommendations. It's a very competitive global process. And the TED residency program selected me to be a part of this incubator in its second class. That was last fall, the fall of 2016. Well, the idea came out of frustration. So when I started my consulting business, whenever you're an entrepreneur, you have to network a lot. You have to let people know that you're available and what you're available to do. And so someone I met said, oh, wow, you're visually impaired too. I know somebody in one of those organizations, and you should meet that person. So we got connected, and, I let this person know what I was available and to do, and that I was available to do it. And the response was, wow, how do you do that and you're visually impaired? And I was like, wait a second. 20/20 sighted people have been saying that to me for a long time. How do you do that and you're visually impaired? But my response has always been, oh, you silly, fully sighted people. You just don't understand. You'd do the same thing if you were in my shoes. Well, now I have someone who works for an organization that is an advocate for people who are partially sighted or visually impaired or blind, and you're saying the same thing. How do you do all of that and you're visually impaired? And my response was, you should know how this is possible. You should be advocating that this is more broadly possible than it is. So I found myself at a really interesting intersection, and the more I got involved with some of these organizations, because they were pretty excited that I kind of materialized, and I was pretty excited to know them. But the more that happened and the more I interfaced with folks in this space, the more they called me disabled. And I just sort of sat back and I said, I've never been called disabled in my entire life. And I'm not sure where you all come off labeling me as this. And I was getting very frustrated that somehow all of a sudden people who were advocates for potential and possibility and all the things that people can accomplish are the ones who are calling me disabled. And it sort of all ended up with, there was just one incident. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, and I had just had enough. And so someone called me disabled, and I couldn't let it roll off my back anymore. And over dinner with a friend, I was just on a tear. It was a rant. And I said, I just can't take it. And if you want to call me disabled, I'll tell you what, I failed at being disabled. And then I sat back and I was like, wow, that could be a good idea for a talk. And then I got the TED residency application the next day from a friend of mine. And he said, you should put your consulting business in. That would be really great. Your ideas are kind of TED-like and it's pretty interesting. And I said, absolutely not. I've got a better idea. And I took my rant that ended with how I fail at being disabled, and I turned it into the TED residency application. And the TED residency program said, this is pretty great. Why don't you come join us? And I said, are you sure? Because this is the least thought out idea I've ever had in my life. And they said, no. This is an idea worth spreading, which is the TED tagline. It's ideas worth spreading. We really want you to come join us. So last fall, I spent time thinking about how is it possible that highly competent people are labeled disabled? How is it possible that because of that label, people who may be equally competent, more competent, or less competent can judge those people as not worthy of talent and potential and skill because of this label of being disabled. And how does that specific word detonate a mindset of baseless assumptions that aren't actually true, because there are a lot of talented people out there with all sorts of circumstances. But because my circumstance has a clinical diagnosis and is slotted in a particular way because of policy, all of a sudden now you think I can't do anything, or you have limited expectations of what I can do. And so I took the time to sort of explore that, and I thought about all the different stories over the course of my being visually impaired life. And that's how the TED Talk came about, because it's, sort of rooted in some frustration that other people think that they can impose, and me saying, no, I'm highly competent. I just do it differently. So the experience of writing the TED Talk stemmed from all of that. Technically speaking, it's a highly iterative process. So for any of your listeners who are whip smart students and they can push out a paper and just the first version, hand it in and get an A, that's not a TED Talk. The version of my TED Talk that made it on stage was many, many, many iterations and edits and changes and influences, and talking to my fellow TED residents who were just as smart and innovative and courageous and creative as they come. And we all helped each other in the process. And then it's a matter of memorizing it and rehearsing it and then getting on stage and delivering it. So the experience for me was wonderful, but I use all the words and explanations so that anyone hearing the word wonderful doesn't sort of interpret it in their own way. It really was a lot of effort, a lot of focus, a lot of dedication, and I enjoyed the process very, very much.
I really like the superpower of ricocheting off glass windows.
Yeah, I'll actually give one. I'll let your audience know there's a missing word, because I've used that phrase many, many times, and it's gracefully ricocheting off of glass walls, which actually makes it even funnier, because when you imagine somebody gracefully ricocheting, like, how does that happen? Modern day design is not always best suited for people with visual impairment. And I have gotten goose eggs on my forehead and just walked into doors that weren't open, or I try to find a door that's not there, or I actually, this is so embarrassing, but this is what I do, right? I went to an office that it was my first time there. I was not familiar with it. And I got to the office, and the whole front of the office was a glass wall. It's in a New York City office building. So I stood on the opposite side of the glass wall, and I called into the office and I said, I'm here. If you look outside, you'll see me standing here. I'm not sure where the door is. And they started, they knew I was visually impaired, and we had a nice relationship. So they started laughing, and they said, if you look to your right, you'll see that the door is already open. And so they had opened the door to help me figure out where the door was. And all I saw was a complete glass panel. So yeah, clear glass and I are not always very good friends. Ricocheting off of it happens more often than I'd like to admit. But yeah, once you do it so many times, you really do become good at it.
Well, we'll put the link to your TED Talk in the show notes, so everybody should get a chance to see that, because I was laughing. It caught my attention. I don't know how I came across it, and all of a sudden there it was, and it was one of those ones that you just start, and you're going to finish this one. You know what I mean? It's just right, yeah. It kept on rolling.
Thank you. I mean, thank you so much for the kind words. I really appreciate it, and I do hope your listeners watch the talk or listen to the talk. What's been very meaningful for me is that folks around the world have sent me messages to say, thank you so much for giving me some words that I can use so that I can do what I always know is possible for me, but other people don't let me. And I'm glad to have offered something that's been so helpful to others, because that's really what it was intended to do. It was really to help orient fully sighted people about the capacities of others and not to impose limitations where they don't belong. And an extra benefit is to give voice to some folks who are looking for the words and hadn't quite found them yet themselves.
Well, it was a really good talk. And what I really like about it is it wasn't geared towards the blind. Let me say that, just say blind.
Sure.
It was geared towards everybody.
Yeah.
As a blind person, someone with visual impairment, I was laughing because I can see the humor in it. But I think it was very educational for coworkers or people who may know someone who is blind. They'll get a lot out of it because they're seeing you do the talk. And it was really educational.
Well, thanks. I was really trying to go for that because, again, it was this experience where people I didn't know kept calling me disabled. They didn't ask me if that was okay. They just assumed that that was okay for them to do. And I don't think it's okay because I could tell by the tone of voice when people, your disability, and there's a tone of pity there. And I'm uninterested in being pitied. I'm interested in being the best person that I can be and to be successful in the endeavors that I go after. And somebody pitying me is really an unfortunate obstacle that is unsolicited. I think this was my way of trying to get folks to broaden their thinking and reshape their philosophy, transform their philosophy on what is possible. And, quite frankly, I've led really amazing teams in my career, but the team that I mentioned, 3 specific folks in the talk, the pillar of masterly acumen, the biscuit butter, and the voice of reason, that team was a spectacular team. And it was one that was national. People were around the country. And for that particular role, I was on a plane on average 3 days a week, flying everywhere. And one of the members of my team, I was the only not fully sighted person on the team. One of them said to me one day, if you can do everything you can do, what's my excuse? And as a boss, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. But as a human being, I will never forget that moment because it allowed someone who instantly allowed a transformative thinking in what people thought I was capable of because they were using my visual impairment as the only criteria for making that judgment. I think that moment definitely is a foundational element of the TED Talk, because when I have that and I'm like, yeah, what is your excuse? And why do I do the things that I do? And why do other people think that I can't do things? And even further, why do other people think that they can't do things themselves? Why do people put limitations on their own selves? And if everyone actually were able to be the best possible version of themselves, what actually could this world look like? So this land of possibility that people prevent because they put obstacles in their own way and put obstacles in other people's way, and they use some sort of empirical evidence that they feel is rationale enough for making that judgment, I just don't buy into it. And I think the TED Talk is sort of comes from that philosophy.
It was well done, and I got a lot out of it. And
thank you so much.
When you're talking there, I couldn't help but doing a little self-evaluation on myself a little bit. But
I do that to people. Yeah.
When you're talking in conversation with people or something out there in the real world, like we live in a bubble, but in the real world,
yeah, no, I know what you mean.
I can sense when someone has a feeling inside them, or not a feeling, but I sense that they're going to have a Boy Scout moment come out where they're going to help me. I can just sense that. And that, to me, that just takes the wind out of my sail with them a little bit, because I want to keep moving in the direction I'm going, keep this productivity or whatever going. And then you sense this person is just waiting for me to make a mistake or take a left, not a right, or I don't know. It's just
sure. Oh, yeah.
It's an odd feeling.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about. And it's this weird sixth sense that I know many people have. And, I have gotten to the point where, because you raise a really good point, that other people are waiting for you to make a mistake. Well, but they also make mistakes. Mm-hmm. So, and that was sort of like kind of why I threw in tip number 3, everybody is disabled in some way. Nobody's perfect. Nobody has all the tools in the toolbox. Nobody is an exceptional human being with every skill at gold medal winning performance of every second, of every minute, of every hour, of every day, of every week of their life. It just doesn't happen. So when someone thinks that you're different, again, they use that as some justifiable excuse for their rationale of why they can think less of you. And because I don't buy into that, I'm happy to cut them off at the pass. But because of Stargardt's, for those of you who don't know, it's the deterioration of the macula, the center of the retina. So I have no center vision, but I have peripheral. And how I explain it to fully sighted people is that because I see my entire world out of my peripheral, where they have peripheral and macula, my peripheral sort of gets double duty, which means that I will see something rolling on the floor faster than they will, because the peripheral is designed to see movement and the macula is designed to see static. And then for a fully sighted person, those two things work together so they could see, all sorts of things. So I don't have the macula, I have the peripheral. I'll see something moving faster, but they'll know what it is. I don't know if it's a roach or a bottle cap or something else. Right. Right. So if I see it moving real quick, I'm just going to jump no matter what. And, because this happened, they were like, no, it's just a bottle cap. And I was like, oh, and they said, oh, you thought it was a mouse? And I said, of course I thought it was a mouse, instead of, like I'm visually impaired. So there have been situations where people have said accusatorily, you said you couldn't see, because I saw something that they did. And I looked back at them and I said, you said you could. And all of a sudden, people are like, wait a second. Not only is she at sassy pants, but she actually made a really good point. And so what I've explained to fully sighted people is that the way I process the world, because fully sighted people are really in tuned to vision. And quite frankly, it's amazing. I mean, when somebody can read something over my shoulder from like 50 feet back, because I have it so large on my computer screen, to me, that's amazing. What a fully sighted person can see is really amazing. But vision is a way of processing the world. Just because I process the world differently doesn't mean that my skill set is diminished. So there are fully sighted friends of mine who, when we go someplace, if we're traveling together, they'll say, Susan, just pay attention for X, like do what you do that thing you do, just to make sure that X, Y, and Z doesn't happen. So I have my job, and my job is a result of the skills that I've developed because I'm visually impaired. And I look at them and I'm like, wow, you're fully sighted. How come you can't do it? And it's because of their 20/20 sighted vision that it hasn't been necessary for them to develop other skills of processing the world in different ways. So it's just different. I know folks who have Usher's syndrome, so they have vision loss and hearing loss. And some of them identify people by scent, by the way a human being smells. Well, I can't do that. But because somebody can identify somebody by scent or by facial recognition, who's to say one is better than the other?
I haven't met too many people that have that. I lost my central and I have the peripheral. That type of vision is like myself. With the peripheral, you kind of use it like a paintbrush and you paint the scene in front of you, because what you're looking at, I can make things disappear. If I look right where the voice is, there's nothing there. Right where my computer screen is, it goes away.
Right.
So, but if I scan, I can put it all together because I have seen before. And
yes.
And I recognize how the picture should look. The puzzle's a little skewed, but I can paint the picture in my mind, and I get along that way.
That's a great way of describing it. And I would say that I kind of do the same thing. And it's just a different way of processing the world.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It works.
It does. Yeah, clearly.
Well, both of us. We don't have much choice. We'd have to do what we got and use what we got. And everyone else is just wondering sometimes.
Yeah, and it's okay for them to wonder, because, I wonder what it's like to see 20/20, especially, when certain things happen, people can read things from a very far distance. Or I cycle. So it's on a tandem bike and I'm on the back, obviously, because it's too dangerous for me to be on the front. And I will see captains. I had noticed the captain, which is the name of the person on the front of the bike.
Mm-hmm.
They would nod, and I was like, "Who are you nodding at?" And they said, "Oh, well, they're a cyclist, like on the other side of the highway." And so it's just what they do. Cyclists, they acknowledge each other by making eye contact and just nod, and then they keep going in their respective directions.
International cyclist nod.
Exactly. Yes, that. And so I can see the nod of my captain from the back of the bike, because I'm like 3 feet from his head or her head. But I had no idea what was happening. And so I said to a couple of them, you can actually make eye contact with somebody from all the way over here. And they were like, yeah. I said, that's amazing. What you guys do is absolutely amazing. It's what they have. It's, we all have, as I joked around with some of my friends recently. I was like, I don't look at a guy and be like, wow, you use a urinal when you go to the bathroom. How do you do that? That's that's really incredible. You don't say things like that. So how it's okay to say things to somebody who has a visual impairment or a hearing loss, or, what I get, you might get this too. I see just like you when I take my glasses off. Now, I understand that that's coming from a good place, and people are just trying to relate to someone else and build a human-to-human connection, and I totally appreciate it. However, it is the equivalent of saying to someone who uses a wheelchair, I'm just like you when I sit down. It just doesn't make any sense. So some of the things that people say in sort of processing what they think is somebody else's experience is a little bit of wackadoodle, but it is what it is. And I would say generally, most people mean very well. And we've all had our experience with jerks and all have our ways of dealing with that. But, we have our way, and our way is just different than somebody else's way. So.
Mm-hmm. I think with vision loss myself, it's really opened up my eyes, if I may say, or my mind to understanding that everyone's different, whether it be a certain degree or another degree. And someone once said something about a disability, that word. They said something, and I don't know how they said it, but to me it was like everyone's potentially disabled.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
For someone to have an opinion on, it was just one of those moments that just made me cock my head like, who's better than anybody else?
Yes. And you use the perfect word, which is opinion. It's someone else's opinion that they feel justified in making to complement the experience you just shared, having, built high performance teams and being responsible as a team leader. I know you don't get any two people that are exactly alike. So the team that I mentioned during my TED Talk, one person, she had an uncanny way of sniffing out who the biggest decision maker was in a company. And she had a great way of being able to network with those kinds of people. Somebody else had a tremendous capacity for finding errors in printed materials and did a better job than people who were hired to do it professionally. Somebody else had a tremendous capacity for preparing things and making sure that everybody else had exactly what they needed when they needed it. So all of these skills were, and I could go on and on for the rest of the team, but everybody brought something very unique to the table. And without each of those superpowers, our team would not have been successful. And so I've started looking at people very differently that way too, to say, I don't really care what you can't do. I want to know what you can do. And let's talk about that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Susan, we touched on drive. Who influenced or what influenced your drive?
My grandparents, my mother's parents in particular, I got to spend a lot of time with them growing up. My parents and my grandparents instilled this, always do your best. And it wasn't a command. It wasn't said in a way that was stressful. It wasn't like you better do it wasn't that kind of thing. It was, if you're going to try your best. If you're going to, be a student, do the best that you can do. And so I think the drive just comes from that. I sort of took it up a notch on an intensity scale, but it was wanting to do my best and then wondering if my best was finite. And where do we find the new boundary, and how do you find the new boundary, and what is best? So if I get an A in 5 subjects, is there some way that I could get a 6th subject on the schedule? Because you can't get better than an A in school. So I was always sort of creatively playing around with what is best. I think that's probably where it comes from, but it stems from just being very encouraged as a child to always do my best. And, when I got to the TED residency last fall, someone in the residency, when we all, introduced ourselves and we got to know each other a little bit, maybe a week or two in, because the residency is 14 weeks long, somebody said, this is an environment where steel sharpens steel. And that probably is good language for it too, because it's like, how do you actually get better? What's new? What's pushing the boundary? Take that pioneering spirit, and what's the next step that nobody has even thought of yet? Because if you think about, what's a telephone in the Middle Ages? Mm-hmm. What's an iPhone in 1965? Something is always getting better, and how do you make that happen? It's just very exciting and interesting to me.
Yeah, when you mentioned you had that perfect team, someone had all these skills, making sure everyone had this and all that stuff. It's like, it's not competition. It's the ability to realize someone has that skill set, you have your skill set, and together you can build a team with that.
Oh yeah. I love building high performance teams. It really is one of my most favorite things to do. I think it stems from going to Penn State, where, Penn State has this football program, a storied football program. Certainly, in recent years there've, been lots of things that are incredibly unfortunate, and those things are being pursued with the appropriate authorities. As a program, Penn State football, it's a thing. And when you're at Penn State, going to Beaver Stadium and going to the football games on Saturdays is part of the student experience. And when you start to really think about what is football, it's all about team. It's offense and defense and special teams, and all three components need to work together in order to win a game. But then when you break down those pieces, you've got quarterbacks and centers and left tackles and wide receivers and fullbacks and nickelbacks and linebackers and kickers and long snappers, and all of a sudden everybody has a specialized role that, when it's all put together, creates a winning opportunity for everybody. And when I deconstructed that for myself in my own brain and had the opportunity to actually build teams, I was in a leadership role where I was able to select really great people to be on teams. I brought that philosophy to it, and I found people who kind of were of my mindset, which was, what is the best that we can do and how can we make it better? It was not unusual for other people to look at our teams and say, like, how do you guys do that? Like, how do you do so much? How do you always, how do you make it happen? And, people were really scratching their heads about how impossible it seemed from their point of view and how easily achievable it was for us.
Just something just came to my mind is that, I don't know if this is right, but that's how you get more hours in the day.
It is how you get more hours in the day. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Another way to get more hours in the day is to fly west. Okay, there you go.
Susan, it's been great talking to you on here. Is there anything else you would like to tell our listeners?
Well, I would like to tell all of your listeners to follow their dreams. I think that that's very important, because their dreams are their own and they know how to pursue them and what help they need, and to go for it. I would also love, if I could be so bold, I would love for folks to read my blog. It stemmed out of the TED Talk. So the blog is called Old Fabled One, where fabled is a mashup of failing at being disabled. So you take the F from fail and the abled from disabled, and that's how you get fabled. And I would love for people to participate in the conversation and let me know what they think about the topics or any other topics that they'd like to hear about. And they can certainly be in touch on Twitter, or they can email me too at ofabledone@gmail.com.
I gotta admit, I loved when I heard that coming over my screen reader, Old Fabled One. It was just like, how unique. Old Fabled One. It was like, someone has spoken. And I was like, wow.
Right. Yeah, it was intended to try to get people to really listen. And a friend of mine came up with the title, and so he gets all the credit for that. And it really just makes a lot of sense, because, again, people use that word disability, and it puts you in a space of what can't be possible, and failing at what can't be possible is probably a really good thing.
Well, great. So check out Susan Robinson's TED Talk in the show notes. We'll put the links there. And it's been great talking to you, great meeting you, and such an inspiration. Your motivation, your drive, and everything, it just makes me want to do more. I like, like how they say, surround yourself with people.
Right, yes.
And just by talking to you, so I can imagine if I had like 10 friends like you, I would get stuff done, be doing stuff.
Oh yeah, you're getting a lot of stuff done, Jeff, and I am happy to be an accountability partner. So we can check in by email or whatever, like once a month or whatever you like, just to see how things are going along. But I will say this has been a real pleasure, and I'm so appreciative that you had me on the Blind Abilities podcast. It's very special for me, and I'm hopeful that your listeners got something really meaningful out of it.
I'm sure they will. Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure. Such a great time talking to Susan Robinson, and you can follow her blog, Old Fabled One. We have the links in the show notes. We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Susan Robinson, and a big shout out to Chi-Chow for his wonderful music. You can follow him on Twitter at El Chi-Chow. Thanks a lot, Chi-Chow. And thank you, Susan, and thank all of you for listening. And until next time, bye-bye.
When we share
what we see
through each other's eyes, we can then begin to bridge the gap between
the limited expectations and the realities
of blind abilities.
The realities of blind abilities.
For more podcasts with a blindness perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities, download our app from the App Store, blindabilities, that's 2 words, or send us an email at info@blindabilities.com. Thanks for listening.